Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leading the charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS, or the American Descendants of
The controversial group
ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of Fados podcast, a weekly show where we bring you undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. This is episode 18, and I'm your host, Lisa Todd, along with my co-host,
Daud Giazan. On today's show, we will share articles from Democracy Now!, In These Times, Newsweek, Black American DOS Caucus, and the Hartford Courant. Later in the show, stay tuned for our main event, where we dive into and interview the article, What the Black-on-Black Crime Fallacy Misses About Race and Gun Deaths.
Personality.
Peace.
This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose a question that forces us to have personalities and opinions.
Okay, what questions do you have for us this week?
Can ADOS appropriate African culture?
How do you mean?
Well, online these days, people aren't too happy with Beyonce. I know we discussed this several times in the past few episodes, but it didn't start with Beyonce. There have been times where online I've read, don't wear our kente cloth, or don't wear dashikis. That's a costume that Black Americans are wearing. You're appropriating African culture. Personally, I've been out and worn like a head wrap, and the stares that I get from African women is like, I shouldn't have that on. You know what I mean? A lot of times when Black women get their hair braided, we get told that that's an African style of wearing your hair. When you braid your hair, French braids or whatever, however you're braiding your hair, that's an African style. It's subtle, but we've even before Beyonce have been told that we are appropriating African culture, even though that is a part of our lineage. So we didn't just look at a magazine, an African magazine or an African movie or African artist and say, ooh, we want to do that. No, it was passed down from generation to generation. Even though we are American descendants of slavery, we have an African lineage part of in us. So that part of our lineage was passed down. So the hair braiding, the clothing. How are you, African, telling us that we are appropriating our lineage?
Well, there are three.
And I'm sorry.
Go
this
ahead.
This came up is because we are mixed.
Yeah.
In the sense,
I was going to refer to that.
Now, I understand that. See, when we did the personality piece, you took the approach of race in the sense that we're the Kadroon, Madroon, Mulatto, whatever those words are.
Very good.
Octoroons. You took race part of it. I was talking more culturally, in the sense that we are between cultures, and both of those cultures we can lay claim to. We are deciding specifically right now to claim to the ADOS because
lineage.
There's and a justice claim specific to that side of our family.
Yes.
So this is a part. African is a part of our lineage as well. Yes, it got cut off. It got interrupted with slavery, but a lot of those traditions still.
Culturally, yes, that's a definite example of admixture, which is why I entered from a different perspective Bruce Lee's cultural adaptation of American art through boxing incorporating it to a Chinese art form. So I did get that aspect of it, but you did lead with race, so I went with race. But I did mention the cultural. So here, strictly on the cultural, there are three things going on here that I think often get missed, and the nuance that we often also don't include in having these discussions. One, the concerns about cultural appropriations are valid, especially the more divergent the culture who's doing the cooptation, that are able to utilize that to benefit them materially. See, that should ring a point. So we are very valid and concerned as African American ADOS, concerned about how since the 50s, music in particular, they were able to culturally appropriate our styles, converting rhythm and blues to rock and roll, and then cheating Black performers who did it better from gaining both prominence and income and resources by their efforts. That's cultural appropriation, and that should be condemned. Second stage, to the degree to which people are expressing their natural innate cultural values and connections to the mother continent, that is not appropriation. That is living what is a part of you. And this has been described linguistically by doctors in the field, displaying the reason why Black people communicate the way they do, directly connected to our slave experience and our origins from the continent. Already documented. That's where such criticisms are totally invalid. The last stage is being entertainment and selling, and I did mention this also last time, selling white people, which are ultimately her primary audience because they spend the most. She is doing things that have both appeal to them at times.
Yeah, and I don't know any Black person with Disney Plus. Sorry. I'm sorry. And I ain't buying it. And let me go on. Let me move on.
Some of the cultural appropriation that she engages in, and it could be identified as such, is also playing to their notions of Africa, Mother Africa. And also some Black people who don't know our connections, who buy into some of those images and those ideas. So there's three areas that could be called for nuance and understanding how people may find fault or issue. The issue for her is, what with her artistry is she doing with that? Is she staying and reinforcing those European-induced mindsets of Africa? Or is she creating something new that brings people to both understand and incorporate and value those human traits? And time tells on that. And sometimes the work itself, I haven't seen any of her work, so I don't know. And I just heard about the criticisms. So in that sense, some African people are valid to be concerned. At the same time, for the other things you mentioned, like hair thing and everything, they have no stance there because Africa never left us. It's been diminished because of our experience, but it hasn't left us, and it's been demonstrated by doctors in the field, professionals in the field, to show the connections we still have to the mother continent.
Yeah, and of course, most won't, especially Pan-Africans, won't admit that a part of don't culturally appropriate our Africanness speaks to what Tone and Yvette always said, has to do with the fact that they see that we are different. We're different.
True.
And a lot of us don't want to admit that. We're the same color, I keep saying, and Tone and Yvette have said, yes, we're the same color. We're all Black. We have melanin. We're beautiful. We're in the diaspora. We're different. And so they recognize that there's a difference. And so when we wear their clothes or wear their hairstyles, we're the mixed kids pretending. You know what I mean? We're the mixed kids pretending to be African. No, that's not entirely true. And for all those reasons you just went through. So pre-ADOS, it kind of hurt my feelings because I was Pan-African and I would hear this rhetoric from Africans. I'm like, what are you talking about? I can't wear a dashiki. I can't do these types of things. I can't, I have African masks hanging on my walls. I have African drums and things in my home. Beautiful. And, I'm African and I'm American. So I was a part of the Pan-African. I wasn't
deep dive
yeah,
into
I
it.
just recognized
I
red,
was
black, and
once.
green.
Yeah.
Yeah. I recognized red, black, and green, and that meant that it was, if you had melanin and we all were one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you get to looking around and things ain't the same for everybody, and you start to question that, and then that's where ADOS came in. So yeah, things did change once I recognized and accepted the ADOS lineage, and seeing pride in that, and not being ashamed of my ancestors being slaves here in America, and being proud that they built this country. It was disheartening to hear it prior to it. Now I'm like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah,
I get it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a question I wanted to get your take on, because I knew you were Pan-African, and
I still consider
am.
myself.
Yeah.
One. I realize that it has to take place in stages, and we're just not at the stage where a full Pan-African worldview can be realized. One day it can, and one of the things that help us to get there is if where every African is on the planet, they drop their buckets where they stand in the lands of their current births and make justice demands, and we're leading the way on that. They will copy us and gain or lose attribution because of their experience in those lands, and then we'll have the resource might to bring forth a united Africa. At the same time, Africans on the continent can be working to disallow those boundaries that were put up by Europeans. They can disallow the stranglehold that American and other European powers have on controlling manipulated leaders of those countries. And everybody knows this. That's the work they need to do. Within this context, we cannot have a unified Africa for a Pan-Africanist vision to be realized. That's just real. It took me 15 years to realize that. I'm glad I finally did, but just not until Tony Yvette did I have a means to express that more clearly than I did in 1995, when I had that realization after 2 attempts I made to do business deals across the pond to African countries and have them undermined by African leaders. That was my experience. And with them, I've learned better why. I knew then at the time, but I was able to put the words better together as Tony Yvette articulated the levels of, could be said, tribalism, which is the word that people dislike, or nationhood status or ethnic status was also played a role in undermining my particular earlier attempts. And I realized that at the time, and my concern was, how can we? I was caught in this little bubble. How can we realize Pan-African vision with these disillusioned people on the continent still acting as though they're either pre or current colonialists and bowing to colonialism still? How can we? And I kept asking. Well, the answer came with advocacy where my recent ancestors' bones are buried. Going for the justice claim to repair what was done to them so that we can be stronger and advocate for that united Africa. For me, I'm still Pan-Africanist, but I realize it's an issue of priorities. And right now, the priority is where I am and making that stand stronger so that I can help my brothers and sisters on the continent realize a united Africa.
Yeah, so our flags are planted in where we are. And right now it is ADOS. We'll wear what we want, we'll wear when we want to wear it. And I understand that you may feel that it's culturally appropriating your culture, but you'll realize once you dig deeper that it is also our culture.
If you can prove that I'm exploiting and in utilizing the things I choose to dress, the way we wear our hair, the clothes we choose to wear, as a way of demeaning or profiting off you, then you got something to say. But if you don't have that,
Amen.
Then all you're doing is name calling, and children do that all day. We need to be better as adults.
Amen.
Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every 4th Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. You can also get more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda. Please visit ados101.com. This week in ADOS history, we give listeners a chance to know the strides ADOS made despite efforts to keep us bottom cast. From the week of August 7th to the 13th, we have...
On August 9th, 1936, sprinting sensation Jesse Owens wins a total of 4 gold medals at the Olympics in Berlin, Germany. Born in Lawrence County, Alabama, Owens gained international fame for his victories in the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 100-meter relay. His victories undermined Adolf Hitler's claims of white, especially German, superiority over all other peoples. However, Owens disputed claims that the Nazi leader was so infuriated with him that he refused to shake his hand. According to Owens, during his only encounter with Hitler, the Chancellor waved and I waved back. The pack-a-day cigarette smoker died at the relatively young age of 66 on March 31st, 1980.
1906, the Brownsville Affair takes place. Angry black soldiers who had been subjected to intense racial discrimination and insults are accused of sneaking into Brownsville, Texas, and killing a local white bartender and wounding a police officer. Although the evidence was weak, President Theodore Roosevelt sided with Brownsville whites and ordered 167 of the black soldiers dishonorably discharged for a conspiracy of silence because they either denied involvement in the shootings or refused to say who was involved. However, 66 years later, as a result of the findings of a book, the Army opened a new investigation which cleared the accused soldiers and reversed the 1906 dishonorably discharges. Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of ADOS podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life. In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have...
Beyonce's Black is King is not about cultural appropriation. It's a sober truth about black people's yearning to belong. Tagline: for people like me, there is a gaping hole in our traceable past. I am reminded of this gaping hole every time anyone appears to innocently ask me, but where are you really from? From the publication The Independent, and the writer is Tanika Smith. When the trailer was released for Beyonce's new film Black is King, described as a celebratory memoir for the world on black experience, countless Africans commented on how this was an appropriation of African culture. It poses an interesting, if unanswerable, question about African American and Black British identity, an issue that in ordinary times is often compartmentalized in the recess of subconsciousness, only to dog us cyclically when racial tensions arise. How helpful is it for Beyonce as a black African American woman to be reprimanded on the count of so-called cultural appropriation? Or should her right to be fascinated by her ancestral culture, a culture effectively stolen from her and every black person domiciled on civilized Western land because of the provenance of slavery, be accepted? Criticism of Beyonce's for reinforcing lazy tropes and peddling a homogenous narrative of African culture that disregards the nuances and individual identities of the 54 different countries within the continent is a reflection of a far more simplistic and sober truth, and one that every black person whose ancestors were enslaved must get: displacement and the human compulsion to belong. In this ever-divisive world, even the term racism is being appropriated and aped by those fortunate enough to never have a lived experience of discrimination. There are much more pressing things to be angry about than an African American using her platform to question, explore, and artistically interpret a way in which to fill the gap in her identity. I graded this article good and reinforces our discussion we had a few episodes back and what we discussed today on how Beyonce's art is being interpreted as cultural appropriation. The Black is King visual album is out now and getting mixed and rave reviews. I haven't seen it because it sits behind Disney's paywall, but what it really speaks to is, who is it meant for? It cannot be for the average ADOS, as we can afford the extra cost of multiple streaming channels, which all seem to want $19.99 or $9.99, but there are 50 channels, so unless you put your streaming channels in a package like cable, I ain't buying it. I'm ranting at this point, so I'll just say up next.
From the publication Democracy Now!, entitled Public Health versus Politics, White House scrapped nationwide COVID-19 testing plan to hurt blue states. Tagline: President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, launched a White House task force with the goal of establishing a national testing plan. We speak to investigative reporter Catherine Eban, whose explosive Vanity Fair report chronicles Kushner's fumbling efforts and the sudden decision to abandon the project on political grounds. Author Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez. Stated by Catherine Eban. So, starting in March, it was very clear to every public health expert that we needed a nationally organized diagnostic testing plan, one that could surge supplies, allocate test kits, allocate precious laboratory capacity. And Jared Kushner, inside the White House, gathered a group of his associates, including his college roommate, some Morgan Stanley bankers, a sort of brain trust. They began reaching out to billionaires who did not have political health experience per se, but then they brought in a group of diagnostic testing experts from the industry. The participants expected that at any moment in early April, the plan would be announced. It vanished into thin air, as one participant described it. Stated by Amy Goodman. Why? And what was the reason? Catherine Eban responds. So, the plan at that moment hit shifting sentiment at the White House. The view at that point in early April, in part, led to predictions by Dr. Deborah Birx, is that the virus was on its way out. It was subsiding. There was a view that a national testing plan would be an enormous effort with a lot of political liability. But there was an additional calculation, which is that this was mostly affecting blue states. And if a political argument was needed, they could simply blame those Democratic governors for the spread. And so the national testing plan was abandoned. And on April 27th, Trump stepped to the podium in the Rose Garden and announced the administration plan, which bore no resemblance to the one hammered out by the group. And that really has led to what we have seen over this terrible summer. Miles-long lines of cars in Texas and in Arizona waiting online to get tests. People waiting 7+ days to get results, which essentially renders the tests useless. And that's where we are. You know, we cannot monitor where this virus is at this point because we don't have enough testing. You cannot fight what you don't see, and that is the predicament we are in currently. I graded this interview broadcast fair. Good that it shows openly how political maneuvering was emphasized over the public's health concerns. Poor, because the writer's use of affecting blue states as opposed to black ADOS deaths. This is how black ADOS concerns go undiscussed. My colleague Lisa Todd was correct when she said in episode 7 that the media acknowledgement of black-related coronavirus deaths made it easy for the administration to proclaim that the virus was behind us and it was time to get back to business as usual, so whites could get a haircut. Here is the evidence hidden behind the words blue states, when in fact it was Trump administration's knowledge of white America's disregard for black life which motivated their decision to make calls for opening up society. I congratulate my colleague Lisa Todd for making this insightful decision to label Trump's actions as anti-black and pro-white life in business so they could get a haircut. I was not totally correct on the matter, given that I did not weigh heavily what we now know today, that they were working on a better, more comprehensive solution, but it was scrapped because they knew black people would die disproportionately. Thank you, Lisa Todd. And next,
many black Americans are planning to vote in person on Election Day. From the publication WIVB, authors and writer WIVB staff. Despite fears that the coronavirus pandemic will worsen, Victor Gibson said he's not planning to take advantage of Michigan's expanded vote-by-mail system when he cast his ballot in November. The retired teacher from Detroit just isn't sure he can trust it. Many black Americans share similar concerns and are planning to vote in person on Election Day, even as mail-in voting expands to more states as a safety precaution during the pandemic. For many, historical skepticism of a system that tried to keep black people from the polls and worries that a mail ballot won't get counted outweighed the prospect of long lines and health dangers from a virus that's disproportionately affected communities of color. Ironically, suspicion of mail-in voting aligns with the views of President Donald Trump, whom many black voters want out of office. I would never change my mind about voting in person in November, said Gibson, who is black and hopes Trump loses. I always feel better sliding my ballot in. We've heard so many controversies about missing absentee ballots. Decades of disenfranchisement are at the heart of the uneasy choice facing black voters, one of the Democratic Party's most important voting groups. Widespread problems with mail-in ballots during this year's primary elections have added to the skepticism at a time when making black voices heard has taken on new urgency during the national reckoning over racial injustice. I graded this article good. If it's one thing we don't do as a people, that is trust this government. Nope, but at the same time, trust them with the ballot you can no longer see as you place it into the machine. You have no idea where it goes. Interesting. It's such a curious entanglement we have. Up next,
from the publication In These Times, entitled How the Foster Care System Punishes the Poor. Tagline, as vital cause to defend the police rise, some have been suggesting these funds be redirected to health and human services departments. These departments, as scholar activist Dorothy Roberts notes, tend to house child welfare and foster care, which provide punishment rather than care for many families, particularly black and brown families. As we call for defunding punitive police systems, it's especially important to recognize the child welfare system for what it is: surveillance, policing, and punishment. From writer Maya Schwanwar and Victoria Law. Child Protective Services agencies and the foster care system exert social control over hundreds of thousands of families across the United States, and these numbers are growing. A 2018 report by the Department of Health and Human Services found a 10% rise in children in foster care nationwide, from 397,600 in 2012 to 437,500 in 2016. Meanwhile, the complete termination of parental rights has also risen precipitously, increasing by about 60% from 2010 to 2016. This dramatic rise in both foster care and parental rights termination targets low-income parents of color, particularly black and Native parents. Advocates have dubbed this phenomenon the new Jane Crow, given that the criminalization of parenting falls largely upon mothers of color, particularly low-income black mothers. Contrary to popular opinion, most of the time, when children are removed from the home, it's not because of abuse. The allegation is usually neglect. Neglect is an allegation that encompasses a range of problems. In addition to leaving a child alone for periods of time, it can refer to homelessness or substandard housing, a lack of weather-appropriate or clean clothing, and chronic lateness or absences from school. Many of these problems stem from poverty and a lack of adequate access to housing, food, and other resources rather than parental malice or indifference. The swelling of the foster care system is another case in which reforms are driving the expansion of surveillance and punishment. The net is widening, and more families are getting caught in it, in part because of the supposedly more compassionate approach to child welfare. I graded this article excellent, a must-read. The Misery Desperation Index has been rising since white elite robbery of the citizens' treasury since 2008. It does not appear to be abating. And next,
title AP Votecast: How Black Women Shape Democratic Politics, from the publication Star Tribune and Associated Press. Writer and author Emily Swanson of the Associated Press. Black women are often called the backbone of the Democratic Party, reliable and loyal voters whose support can make or break a candidate. In 2018, they were more likely than women in any other racial or ethnic group to support Democratic House candidates. According to AP Votecast, which surveyed more than 115,000 voters nationwide, including close to 7,000 black women, making it one of the most in-depth available looks at the group's political views. But that doesn't mean black women are typical Democrats. An AP analysis of the Votecast data reveals that black women's views often stand out as more moderate than the rest of the party. Black women are less likely to identify as liberal, somewhat less likely to support abortion rights, far less concerned about climate change, and somewhat more likely to prioritize jobs and the economy. They are also more protected of President Barack Obama's policies and legacy. In 2020, the influence of those views was especially clear. Black women came out in force to vote for the moderate in the Democratic presidential primary, Obama's former Vice President Joe Biden, and rescued his bid. I graded this article okay. And up next,
from the publication Newsweek, entitled House Could Hear Slavery Reparations Bill for Black Americans This Summer. Writer Jeffrey Martin. Some Democratic lawmakers believe that the current national focus on systemic racism brought about by the death of George Floyd could encourage movement on legislation designed to address the issue of paying slavery reparations to Black people. According to a summary of the bill, H.R. 40 would examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. This includes determining the role of federal and state governments in slavery, current forms of discrimination, and the lingering negative effects of slavery on Black people. There has been no movement on H.R. 40 since its 2019 introduction. Some observers believe that even if the bill passes the House, it could be dismissed in the Senate. While some lawmakers believe that a reparations program is an important move toward reducing the wealth disparity between white and Black people, others have indicated that it would be too difficult to properly enact. I graded this story poor. Fair in that it is mentioning reparations and by accident which Black group that should benefit. For its definition by default cannot mean any and all non-white immigrants who mostly arrived after 1965. Failure in that the authors and Newsweek attempt to propagandize the public. The article attempts to craft another reason why reparations is even being considered by Congress. Then it attempts to weave the old, tired, and discredited argument that reparations is too difficult to solve. Read it in order to observe how white domination racist media attempts to manufacture your consent on this issue. And next,
history of affirmative action policies show how white people have benefited. From the publication The Hartford Courant, author and writer Christina Best Giacomin. When most Americans hear affirmative action, they often think the phrase is referring to a policy that protects African Americans. What many Americans don't know is that affirmative actions are policies that were made by white people to benefit white people exclusively. Moreover, due to the insidious nature of how these policies and practices are integrated into American institutions and culture, white people continue to benefit from them. Another idea that is often being discussed is reparations, specifically for slavery. And a common reaction is slavery ended 200 years ago. How is it relevant today? Racial preference in the workplace began in the United States in the 17th century, when the country transitioned from white indentured servitude for labor to the institution of slavery. Africans replaced the poor white labor force, who in turn were promoted to mid-level positions of policing the enslaved. Slave patrols and overseers is what they became. I graded this article good. Up next,
from the publication Black American DOS Caucus, entitled A Letter to Congresswoman Jackson Lee on H.R. 40 Suggestions. Tagline: We are grateful for your determination to bring H.R. 40 to a vote. In our conversation with Representative G.K. Butterfield this morning, he recommended we write to share what we hope are constructive suggestions for improvement of the effectiveness of the bill. Writer William Sandy Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. We recommend the following changes to H.R. 40. 1. Commissioners should be selected exclusively by Congress. They should be experts in American history, constitutional law, economics, including stratification economics, political science, and sociology. And they should have expertise on the history of slavery and the Jim Crow regime, employment discrimination, wealth inequality, health disparities, unequal education opportunity, criminal justice, and mass incarceration, media, political participation and exclusion, and housing inequalities. 3. The Commission should be directed to set as eligible recipients Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. eligible recipients would need to show that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, a lineage standard, and for at least 12 years prior to the enactment of the reparations plan or a study commission, whichever comes first. They self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American, an identity standard. 4. The relevant window for the Black American claim for reparations dates from 1776 to the present, not 1619 as the bill currently reads. Since the claim for redress must be made by the U.S. government, the beginning date for the claim should be associated with the founding of the Republic, not the landing of enslaved persons at Jamestown, Virginia. We are prepared to respond to any questions you may have or to provide research to assist you, and we are prepared to provide formal testimony at Friday's hearing. I graded this excellent, a must-read for the other 3 points not mentioned here. As for the Newsweek's article attempt to make it seem as though others have indicated that it would be too difficult to properly enact, I believe Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullins could educate those others. Just what was provided here on that matter should get those others at least halfway there. And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted on our Facebook group and in the show notes on our website.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will interview the article entitled, What the Black on Black Crime Fallacy Misses About Race and Gun Deaths, from the publication The Washington Post, author and writer Shirley Carswell. I will ask the questions and Daud will give the answers. So, Ms. Carswell, what's your timelines looking like these days?
My social media timeline of late have been filled with outrage over the police killings of unarmed Black citizens, but after a violent 4th of July weekend around the nation that left several children dead, I noticed an uptick in snarky posts asking, what about Black on Black crime? Why aren't you protesting about that?
So we are back to focusing on crime that only occurs in Black neighborhoods, which always seems to happen whenever the attention is on other people and other people's violence. Sounds like a backlash to me.
The what about Black on Black crime rejoinder usually is meant to imply that African Americans are indifferent to the thousands of young Black men and increasingly Black children who are slain every year in gun violence.
Do these uninformed people think that the Black community does not care about crime? That we don't care about our family and friends dying by the hands of those who may look like us?
Yes, it insinuates that Black people blithely accept killings by our own that have racked some communities for decades and take to the streets only when white police officers are doing the killing.
Seeing that violence and crime occurs in all American neighborhoods, I don't think I've seen anyone focus on or march for white on white crime. I'm sure it has happened, but it doesn't make the news. So it's quite possible if we aren't seeing their response to their violence, then they don't see ours. So can you tell these uninformed people how we have addressed violence in our neighborhoods?
Long before the March for Our Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement dominated the headlines in recent years, African Americans were marching in crime-ridden neighborhoods to protest killings. Devon Mcneal, an 11-year-old fatally shot in Washington, D.C., on July 4th, had just left an anti-violence community event when he was hit by a bullet. The event was put together by his mother, Crystal Mcneal, who works as a violence interrupter, a job that has been created in several urban areas with a goal to mediate neighborhood disputes in an attempt to break the cycle of retaliatory killings.
That is so sad. She was fighting for change and lost her son to violence. She is among many who still fight to stop violence in our neighborhoods, isn't she?
Black citizens have formed hundreds of such organizations to save teens so often caught up in that world. Black artists have written songs and made movies urging youth to stop the violence.
Historically, our neighborhoods couldn't rely on police or the justice systems to even care about our neighborhoods. Things would have to get so bad, and only then would anyone listen and use it politically to promote law and order. When crime is up, we have always sought help from our elected officials.
This is true. Many black people, desperate to stem the homicide rate that spiraled in the 1990s, even supported the Clinton crime bill, although some now criticize it as having hurt the black community more than it helped. A Gallup poll survey in 1994 found that non-white citizens favored it to a greater degree than white citizens, 58% compared to 49%.
Well, of course we did, because despite the media and the racist lie, we actually care about crime and safety. This false narrative that black people don't care about crime needs to stop. What does the data show our position is on these crime trends that tend to rise and fall?
As a group, African Americans are consistently more likely to be concerned about crime than white Americans.
Of course we do.
They also are the staunchest supporters of tougher gun control laws, with 72% saying that controlling gun ownership is more important than protecting gun rights, compared with 40% of white people. White men, in fact, are the demographic most likely to oppose gun control laws of any kind, although statistics show that they might benefit most from them.
So the uninformed people, including our news media, have kept this narrative alive about black on black crime, but the opposite may be true. Why would white men benefit the most from gun control?
Because the majority of the gun deaths in the United States are not homicides, but suicides, and white men account for 74% of them. More than 288,000 white males fatally shot themselves between 1999 and 2018, according to data from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Having access to a gun substantially increases the risk of death by suicide. In other words, if white men didn't have so many guns, they would be much less likely to die.
So these uninformed people, again, are hyper-focused on black crime, and more white men are dying by suicide? Is anyone asking for change in the white community?
Nope. Despite the evidence, 60% of white Americans say gun ownership does more to protect people from crime than to put their personal safety at risk, according to Pew. Black people, by a similar margin, say that gun ownership does more to endanger people's personal safety.
So what's the deeper truth about these numbers? Because no one in the what about black on black crime crowd is talking about this or addressing it.
While most violent crime has fallen dramatically since the early 1990s, gun violence began rising again in recent years. In 2018, the most recent year for complete data, more than 22,000 Americans intentionally killed themselves with a gun, and about 11,000 people were gun homicide victims. The suicide numbers inched up from the previous year, while homicides were down slightly.
With the white majority dying from gun violence and their concern for their own mortality, are there efforts to curtail any of this violence in their community?
Actually, efforts to reduce firearm deaths have been hindered not by community indifference, but by a Congress afraid to cross the National Rifle Association and gun rights supporters. Federally funded research into gun violence solutions ground to a halt after lawmakers passed the Dickey Amendment in 1996. The provision, pushed by the NRA, cut funding for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention study of the issue out of fear that it would be seen as federal agencies advocating for gun control.
So a special interest group has rendered our elected officials ineffective in addressing our nation's crime and gun problem?
Yes. Even faced with repeated mass shootings that have killed hundreds of innocent people, including school children, Congress has refused to act. However, last year, $25 million was approved to study gun violence, the first new funding in 2 decades, but it was half of what had been requested.
Yes, it seems a small amount for the enormous task of studying and researching a problem that we already know the answers to. However, this quick band-aid shows what?
It's an indication of how strongly Republicans and some otherwise liberal Democrats fear offending white voters in swing states more concerned with protecting Second Amendment rights than saving lives, including their own.
So the media. racist, and uninformed black folks focus on the black on black crime on America's streets. At the same time, speak nothing about the high white suicide rate occurring in the same country. Please explain to these people what is actually going on.
Suicide affects white males in nearly every age group, with numbers beginning to rise in the late teen years and peaking in the mid to late 50s. But the rate remains high even among men in their 70s and 80s. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention says that suicide most often is the result of treatable mental health issues and is related to brain functions that affect decision making and behavioral control. As with the homicide rate, however, the reasons behind suicide are more complicated than a single issue. Life stresses combined with known risk factors such as childhood trauma, substance use, or even chronic physical pain can contribute to someone taking their life.
The reasons for suicide can be similar to the gun violence we see with young black males?
Yes. Research has found that many young black men, the group most likely to be perpetrators and victims of gun homicides, suffer from a condition similar to PTSD, brought on by repeated exposure to violence, extreme poverty, high unemployment, drug and alcohol abuse, and other social ills that create a sense of hopelessness.
So the fear mongering that black people, specifically young black males, are just killing everyone 24/7, raping, robbing, stealing day and night, paints our neighborhoods as war zones. Is this what is occurring?
A 2017 report in the Guardian newspaper found that much of America's gun homicide problem happens in a relatively small number of predictable places, often driven by predictable groups of high-risk people, and its burden is anything but random.
While we all focus on black crime and violence, why do you suppose the truth is being hidden from the American people?
With so much media focus on urban homicides, many local news outlets keep a running tally. Suicide, which kills twice as many people, gets comparatively less coverage. Some argue that suicide is a private matter that doesn't affect the broader community.
Doesn't this failure to report accurate news keep black men the face of America's crime? Isn't this protecting a lie that white men aren't violent?
Prevention experts discourage news media outlets from reporting intimate details of suicide cases because research has found that can lead to imitation in vulnerable people. But even general news stories about suicide have tended to focus more on the increasing rates among other demographic groups than on white men's stark overrepresentation in the statistics. That seems to be changing now as the numbers climb. And so, yes, the result of such historically lopsided coverage is that the public face of gun violence in this country is that of a young black man rather than a middle-aged white one.
Is white America in denial in regards to white-on-white crime they ignore? Sounds like white male violence is bigger than it is reported, but they refuse to deal with it and instead focus on crime in the black community as America's only problem.
Reporting the truth about who's committing suicide would require acknowledging that the contemporary narrative in which men in general, and white men in particular, are a universally privileged class and have no legitimate problems. This is false. Columnist Armin Broth wrote last year in a health and wellness newsletter. When white men respond to their life circumstances with gun violence, it's treated as a public health problem brought on by mental illness and stress.
Well, I'm sure black men do not get the same benefit of the doubt or treatment.
When black men do the same, it's portrayed almost solely as a criminal issue caused by lawlessness and moral failing.
Seems Americans have the right to bear arms and the right to die by those same arms. Would you agree?
Yes, and the multiplier in both epidemics is lawmakers' blind devotion to the NRA. Zealously protecting their right to bear arms has come at a huge cost, and as quiet as it's kept, it's not just the black community that is paying.
In conclusion, instead of pretending crime is only happening in black neighborhoods, what do you see happening if we continue to ignore America's crime rates nationally?
Based on the work in my article, More Death,
Well, that completes this interview. Listeners, you can read this full article on our website in this week's show notes. Coming up, we have the commentary on this article. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned. We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articlesofados. Okay, how do we like this black on black crime article?
This was very an excellent article. It went at it in a way that I usually don't when I tackle this issue, but the way they did it was very revealing and at the same time data driven, and that's what I appreciate about it the most.
Yeah, I chose this because, several things have happened after the protest for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And that is, one, with the rise and popularity of Black Lives Matter, with the rise of the hashtag defund the police, there was a backlash, and that was a lot of our crime that was occurring, even during this time of pandemic. It was being highlighted, like, see, this is the reason. And I did a story on it with police saying that we can't defund the police, that crime is rising. And so is this black on black crime narrative has been raised even in the Black community, online, in social media, but more so this gets thrown at us from the white community as a reason why we need not only more police, but there needs to be no changes in the justice system. Is used as an excuse to say that Black lives don't matter because Black lives are killing each other, when in fact white lives kill white lives, Indian lives kill Indian lives, Latinos kill Latino lives. We're people in close proximity of one another. People, it's not random, you know. And as she pointed out in this article, it's not random. These are people that are, some of them honestly are dealing in crime, and they're in the crime world. Killings occur. What happens is when innocent people like children and your grandmothers and your family members that are innocent and not involved in these crime are caught in the crosshairs of these people fighting one another. And of course, the lady in the article was seen as a violence interrupter, so that in those instances where people are fighting in the crime world, are fighting with each other, that there's no retaliatory violence, and lost her son in that process. So crime is occurring not only in Black neighborhoods, it's occurring in America's neighborhoods. And because we focus on Black on Black crime, which is really not real, it's just crime, when we focus on Black crime and not other ways that people are dying by gun violence, which she points out in this article, more white men are dying by suicide with gun violence than homicides. So the reason why you're saying Black on Black crime is because our media focus on it. Our media and our nation has to have Black men as the face of crime, and not telling the truth that really the face of most crime in America is not Black. We're not saying that no Black people are committing crimes. We're saying that your only focus on the Black crimes is a lie, in the sense that now the America's nation thinks that we are the only ones committing crimes, when we're all committing crimes, and the dominant society is committing the most. I mean, there are more of you. You're things are getting desperate times. Substance abuse is on the rise. So it's only logical thing that more people are participating in crimes to get substance abuse. More people are committing crimes to get money to participate in substance abuse. So, and then because of the substance abuse, because of the stresses of life, they're committing suicide. So it's going hand in hand. More white men are committing suicide. 74% is a high number rate of suicide rate. That's a high, really high rate. So, to paint the picture of gun violence in America as the young black kid in Chicago on the Chicago streets, and not the white man in his home putting a gun to his head, that should be the picture of gun violence in America.
And the second picture should be white men going into places of crowds and shooting up people, but it isn't. There's a large view that is not taking shape here in this discussion. We limit it to discussions of issues of guns and then black on black crime and all that stuff. Those, in my opinion, they're just deflections away from the larger argument of the society. Why is our society producing this violence? No one tends to ask that question because I think they're afraid of the ramifications, because then we'd have to indict everything. And that's where I'm willing to go. This has been studied. The study was done almost 7 or 10 years ago of recognizing what does this finally, instead of people just making accusations, oh, you're just being too liberal, or you just are siding with those who commit violence. We've got to mature, people. The large study that has been done concluded the more unequal economically a society, the more drastic, our very discussion last time, the more desperation takes place, the more systematic behavioral responses take place to that. So the more unequal society, the more suicides, the more obesity, the more crime, however you want to label it. The less unequal societies, less so. If we really cared about our children, if we really cared about gun violence, we would take a look at how our society is structured in such a way that raises misery for some and allows it to be funneled into wealthy and smaller wealth classes in the society, that contributes to the levels of inequality that produces these predictable and identifiable outcomes of death. But we are unwilling and sadly so immature to have that discussion. So we're going and chasing, like Yvette often says, whack-a-moles. Oh, it's guns and therefore gun violence. It has to be looked at as the whole, because we are a whole society. And again, the analysis is already done. I'll be glad to put that link in to where the study was done, that sadly our leadership, both white and black, failed to do. Now let's get into the issue of black on black crime or white on white crime. Another lie. It's based out of the desire for white elites to maintain a boogeyman that's both international, that justifies our wars, foreign and domestic. They have to have a domestic boogeyman. Black men and black people generally are that boogeyman. We need to call people on that. Why? On the issue of white on white or black on black crime, what is the difference? The difference is 5%. Rounding up, 90% of black on black crime is a problem. 85% of white on white crime is a problem. Studies have already revealed it has more to do with proximity and ongoing segregation that this is taking place in. Now, why the 5% difference? Nobody ever asked that question. We don't even bring up, as mentioned in the article, white on white crime. The reason is because a very ugly truth would be revealed, that 5% difference comes as a result of what happens within white communities. What happens in white communities? Well, what I said earlier, because finances and economy is worked in such a way that funnels millions of dollars into white elite hands, a white elite minority. Whites among whites are able to distance themselves from lower caste whites. They're able to live in gated communities where whites who are under the pressures of economic inequality can't breach, and therefore they'll commit those crimes amongst themselves. That 5% comes from the fact they can't get into those communities and cause disruption there. That's the reason why there's a difference. If you take that difference out, then the black on black crime accusation is also a white on white crime reality. And no one has that conversation because we're too immature to talk on that level. Why that 5% difference is because whites within white proximity are capable of distancing themselves from lower caste whites, and therefore they're protected to a tune of 5% from the violence that occurs among lower caste whites, brought about because of the wealth extraction from whites that we just don't talk about because we can't address the fact that this tiny white minority from families who are a part of founding this country and own slaves are all too often still dictating what happens in America. And because whites among the white collective are willing to have this discussion because they too see themselves and desire to be white like them, that's another reason why they don't have this discussion. It needs to stop. Our children are paying the price in so many ways. I'll stop there.
Excuse the pandemic recording of the lawnmower, everybody. But I think that if, as a black person, if you're seeing crime, and I understand the need to say violence needs to stop, it does. Our communities need to be made whole as well in order for that to be to happen. So what do you need to do? You need to get involved. There are ADOS chapters around the country that you can get involved in. There's NAACP, there's your National Urban League, not only addressing violence, but also, on the other hand, fighting for making our communities whole. Please get involved. Repairing our neighborhoods repairs the violence in our neighborhoods. This is what I was trying to get to. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I've got to say something else, but I'll let you finish if you know.
No, that's all.
Well, the last thing I have to ask for people to consider, in a sense of trying to hopefully encourage people to be more mature regarding this, ask yourself the question, why the focus on Chicago? Have you asked yourself that question? In essence, is Chicago the number one violent city in America? I'm going to tell you it isn't, but I'm going to leave it to you to look it up because you're not doing that. Instead, you're engaging in these discussions white elites in the media want you to be on. I propose this, that one of the reasons why Chicago is held out as a violence capital when it's not, we get to hear about the problems they're having there, dealing with low resources. That's the problem. Aside from that, the reason why they're choosing Chicago is because that, I suspect, is still a relatively good, strong city that blacks could grow in. But that's not wanted by the white elite there. They want them decimated. They want them removed from choice areas they currently are in. That's why you're going to continue to get reports about how bad Chicago is. And when whites desire another city to go after, that will become the number one city we'll hear all about. But particular to Chicago, it's not the one city of even black on black violence. It's not the city of violence, period. But it has to be elevated to that in the people's mind to justify the displacement and ongoing gentrification of those areas that whites elites there covet. That's the reason why we're even having this discussion about Chicago. That's why Chicago keeps coming up. Please find out what is the number one city of violence in America. It's not Chicago. So then you got to ask yourself, why Chicago? And that's why I went ahead and gave you the answer. It's because black people and other people that are non-white are still occupying areas that are coveted by the white elite there. And they want national support for understanding why either troops got to be moved in because how bad things are there, which will bring down land values and cause further displacement of black people due to the economic struggles we're currently going now. And they will be able to move in and overtake those houses easier because you've agreed and been convinced of the propaganda of black on black crime. And that's out to those black mindless brothers and sisters who don't think beyond what you're told from CNN. I'm sorry. It's just, it sickens me.
Oh, I agree. And that's it for this week's commentary on our article. That's why you can always go to our website and read the show notes, see the articles, read the articles for yourself. There you have it, family. Another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofados.com, where you can join our mailing list, see the show notes for today's episode, and to leave us a voice message to be featured on the show.
Now that you're family, we'd love it if you'd like our Facebook page and join our private Articles of ADOS group. This is where you can connect with other listeners, give feedback, and share articles you would like us to discuss. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
Be sure to tune in next Thursday for a new episode of Undiscussed News you may have missed. Until next time, family, stay safe, stay strong. Peace.